Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. On today's show, back by popular demand, we have Cierra. Woo! Hey, Cierra.
Hi.
Oh man, it's awesome to have you back on. You're encroaching on Chris's and Lily's territory of being one of the more frequent guests. So that's pretty exciting.
Chris and I are in stiff competition. We talk about it as we're falling asleep at night.
Oh wow, that's intense. I'm sorry to cause such a rift. I wanted to have you on. You were on earlier this season talking about Christian counseling, and while we were off air, it kind of like hit me. We've talked at length, just in our normal lives before this podcast was even conceived, and then even more so later on about some of your experiences being adopted. And it kind of like clicked with me where I was like, oh yeah, like that's kind of a thing in Christianity, isn't it?
It
And
is.
so and I was like, that's actually probably a really important thing to talk about, and probably kind of a weird niche to talk about in some people's worldviews. But it's also probably in other people's lives, their whole experience with Christianity is kind of defined by it in some ways. So I know some of these details, but not all of them. So feel free to talk at length about this. But when you were first told you were adopted, what were some of those like initial feelings you had?
Well, I was always aware that I was adopted, which is, not everybody's story. Adoption is interesting because there are so many different ways that it is done and approached, and my story can be my story and also look nothing like the next person's. So personally, I had thought for a long time that my adoption was perhaps one of the only things that I had felt pretty solidified about, one of my only identifiers that I was like, this is all right, because my childhood was pretty rough. And so I kind of was like, well, my mom was crap, but at least she explained this to me well. And I can say that as a young kid, like I just knew, and it seemed fine. It seemed reasonable. My mom had gotten some books that like explained like you're adopted and this makes you special and you're wanted. And then when I was 5, my parents adopted my sister. So I wasn't alone in being adopted. And so my sister and I, that they adopted, we're not blood related at all. But I in my family too, I wasn't the only person who was adopted. And also my biological parents had been friends in a way kind of with my family. So they apparently had been around. There's photos of me when I was like 3 with them, unbeknownst to me. And then when I was about 10, my mom orchestrated something for us to all get together because my biological parents married each other and they had 2 more kids. So I met all of them for the first time when I was 10, and that led to some other things too. But for a long time, it just felt like this thing that I was like, oh, I'm special. And it really, when I was young, left it at that.
Gotcha. Just hearing that, I like 2 simultaneous contradicting feelings like happen where I'm like, oh, that sounds so healthy. Wait, is it? Like I have both those thoughts at once, where it's just like,
Yeah.
because I've heard so many other stories where like it's this like big shocking reveal later in life, and it gives like, these like real deep seated like complexes and like kind
Yeah.
of an identity crisis. But it's interesting for you, it's not it not only was it not an identity crisis, it sounds like for to some extent it was almost like a grounding part of your identity. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, you are. And it's interesting how I've I feel differently about it now as an adult, and actually especially this past year. It's really interesting that we're talking about this now cuz I don't know, prepping for this, thinking about this conversation we were going to have, John, was really actually fundamental to like me wrapping up 2022 because it was exactly about a year ago now that I found out some information about my adoption that completely set me upside down. Now, I can't imagine like if that information was me actually finding out that I'm adopted. I mean, there's no freaking way that I wouldn't have figured that out because I'm absolutely nothing like my family. But I am glad that that was not what was revealed to me because uh, I can't imagine
Yeah.
how painful that is. But it's been honestly losing my faith, realizing my sexual identity, realizing bits and pieces about who I really am. That then, when I also learned this information about my adoption, all of that tied together, I've like now, it's like my eyes were open to like, oh, none of this was okay. A lot of this was really bad. Oh my God, the way people talked about this to me, how, like, I don't, John, you're probably one of the first people outside of like Chris to really ask me questions about my adoption besides the stupid questions I get asked at the doctor's office. Like eh, I haven't really I didn't really give it much thought for a long time, and it's been good to work through now. I'm glad I'm doing the work now, but it's a curious thing.
It certainly is a curious thing, but I understand why some people might not ask about it, just feeling like it's kind of one of those situations where it's like, will I say the wrong thing? And then it ends up making the situation worse by them like treating you like an alien. you know, like
Yeah, yeah.
it's like, no, it would have been better to just ask the cringy
Mhm.
question than to just be a cringy person.
Yeah.
But
Sometimes some people really do ask stupid questions,
oh, really?
but it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I once this is not quite related, but I remember I once just totally stumbled my way through a conversation where someone revealed to me that they were a at their words sperm bank baby.
Mm.
And I just dropped the ball. I just asked every dumb question you could have asked afterwards because I was just so like I'd never met somebody who that was their
Yeah.
experience. So I was just like, oh wow, let me ask all these things that probably every human being always asks you all the time. So you've alluded to this somewhat, but like as you're getting older, let's say maybe even teenage years to young adulthood, like do you still find your identity as an adoptee as like kind of grounding? Do your feelings start shifting at all? Do you stop thinking about it, start thinking about it more? What's that process kind of like?
Specifically, you said teenager to young adult. So
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
what it
So
looked like in high school and college.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
coming of age.
Okay. I see. Yeah. Uh there is so much going on for me in high school with my family. That the times I think when I did think about me being adopted in relation to all of that, it was just more of like questions actually about my health, like me wondering while I struggled really badly with depression and anxiety, like how how influential were those things with my biological family? Could I have gotten more information or better details on how to care for myself? And then also, like, I had an aunt say something really terrible to me when there's a lot going on between my mother and I. And my aunt had said something like, um, you know, I wonder if the reason why you and your mom don't get along as well as me and my daughter do is because you're not blood. And like, I tried to tell myself that I was like, oh, she's dumb. Like, what the hell? Like, that's never been a thing. And then I don't obviously it stuck with me. Here I am, like 10 years later. able to still like picture where she said that to me. And then that same person actually, when I was partway through college, um, said something to me like, I was just talking to your brother. I mean, and said his name. And I was like, you mean he's my brother? Like, and she's like, that's not how I see it. So
Wow.
it was just this one person at that time that was saying these things to me, but it kind of, while internally I told myself, like, if anybody in my family knew this was being said to me, they would be on my team. You know, they'd be mad. Like, I felt so sure of that, which is just interesting because now I look at that version of myself and I'm like, ooh, honey, I think no, they weren't ever really on your team. That's really sad to admit, but there was no reliability on any of these people. And I've slowly started to see the ways that during that time I was still kind of trying to cloak the issues that I was seeing, not as anything related to my adoption, because I had felt so solidified. I had thought, surely I'm a part of this family, like I am. That it took me a long time to be able, I mean, longer than it took, I think, mentally for me to process I'm not a Christian anymore, for me to process they might not have ever viewed me. Some of them may not have ever viewed me as one of them. Um, because that is so much more ingrained in me than religion or anything else.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure that's an ongoing journey, I would assume, of just like trying to process kind of as we all, process our place in the world and how our family dynamics play into that. You've kind of got this part of your family, this this room for there to be more tension than necessarily like a biological kid might have, where it's just like, well, there's while it might sound great, that like, oh, someone chose you or framed some sort of way that like, makes you feel good. It can also be framed, equally, if not more so, like painfully, like where do I belong? Why this? Why that?
Yeah. I think one part of that is, which we can hit on this a whole bunch more, how Christians talk like,
Mm,
um, yeah, you're a gift, you're chosen, like that whole thing with adoption and tied into the gospel.
yeah,
But some of that doesn't make room for the fact that I am different.
yeah,
It's fundamental. And I think that is, while there are so many things that overlap, right? There are so many people, right, who are like, oh, I'm the black sheep of my family biologically, or I somehow am nothing like my sibling. And, like we're blood
right.
related, but we're completely different. Like, while that can be true when you are adopted, it's always that thing plus, and I am adopted,
Plus
Like,
genetics or like
yeah,
plus predispositions,
yeah.
like those kind of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't get away from it, and I wasn't really, like, given space or praised for being different. It was always, right, that, like, that narrative of you're chosen, you're one of us, you're special, you're this thing,
Mhm.
to standards that I could never live up to fill a role that was impossible to fill.
Yeah, there's this very socially constructed role around it too. I think that's a very interesting thing. Before we get too much into some of those nuances in general, just staying on you specifically, in as
Mhm.
much as you're comfortable sharing, you've told me, you, Chris, and all this, I've kind of filled me in on like some of the
Yeah.
most recent revelations surrounding your adoption. As much as you feel like sharing, have at it and tell us some of the crazy stuff.
Well, I'll share just a tiny bit more first about before I like say the thing I found out, kind of what also it was like knowing and meeting my biological family. So my sister and I also have this is where we have very different stories. So my sister has a closed adoption and I have an open adoption. So that means that I know who my parents are. There's always been kind of communication, all this stuff. Now I think my mom wasn't supposed to talk to my sisters family, or maybe it was open, but they just basically didn't want to ever have. She didn't want to communicate with my sister, her biological mom. But I think my mom was trying anyway. I don't know. But so where I had that relationship, my sister doesn't have that. And also, my sister is half Black. So we have a lot of dynamics going on in our family. And I've seen some of these, just the different ways adoption plays out. And so for me, like I can see the whole spectrum when someone says something like, do you wish that you knew your biological family? Like I get asked that before they knew that I have met them and know them pretty well. I see the benefits and cons of both. And I think that's probably a unique perspective to have. Some people spend their whole life wishing that they can know. And some people find out and it's really great. Like for me, it's all right. I went to stay with them a few times because my mom set that up. I think she meant well. But there's weird things that happen, like wanting to call me by the name they had given me and not wanting me to contact my mom while I was with them. And my biological dad got drunk and like told me, which this was the first time I like heard the real thing that had happened, which was that he had wanted my birth mom to have an abortion. And I was 10 when he told me that. But like I interacted with these people. I met my birth siblings, like blood siblings, whatever we want to call. There's so many different names to use to refer to all these people. So I'm sorry if you get confused.
Whatever terminology you use is correct because it's your story.
Okay.
So don't worry about it.
Yeah. Anyway, there's just, it's an interesting vibe. It's unique. And I think I want to share that bit just because I think some people, they have in their head what adoption means. And I can feel confident saying that most people are confused. And when I said those silly questions, it's like I'm at the doctor's and I tell them I don't know my medical history because I am adopted. And that's a choice. Like I'm not once a year checking in with my biological family because I would prefer there to be space. So I just tell them I don't know. And instead I get doctors telling me, have you heard of ancestry.com? Just things I'm like, oh my gosh, like,
No, really?
yeah, I'm always getting people that are trying to tell me like, dude, you could find your biological family. I'm like, I know. I could call them right now.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
That's rough.
just like something for people to be mindful of or to hear this, because I don't think it's every day you end up talking to somebody that's adopted. But the other thing I found out, the thing that was like really a bomb in the water was my dad. When I say my mom and dad, I mean the people who adopted me. My dad has issues with the law. He went to federal prison when I was in high school, and he was never, after he adopted my sister, he was like out of the picture within a year. Like, and this man also had like adopted other kids. He's not all right. And so I was last January, trying to Google about him, and that case specifically, because I realized, I just didn't know if he like had a jury trial or whatever. And what I found actually contradicts the story that I'd always been told about my adoption, which is that my biological parents knew my mom's brother, my uncle, and that when they got pregnant, they couldn't keep me. And my uncle was like, we'll take her. And then a bunch of conversation happened, and my parents had lost a daughter when she was 15. She was murdered. And so they were like, we can give these people a daughter again, which always sounded kind of sus to me. But they tried to act like it was normal. And I, like I said, tried to act like I was normal too. And so I thought that was basically it. But what I found out was that my dad committed vehicular homicide 10 months before I was born. And that while he was awaiting trial, he convinced, and my mom convinced my biological parents to give me to them. And that there also had never been any conversation with my aunt and uncle at all. And so when I mentioned that to my biological mom, she was very confused. It makes it sound like, yeah, they basically, the whole family was like in on this, that they were just going to take me. Um, and then the trial happened the same day that they picked me up from the hospital. And at this trial, my dad was found guilty and facing up to 25 years in federal prison. So why they could take me home, I don't know. And then I guess what happened is the next month was a sentencing. He was sentenced to 10 years. He fought it in court, and it took 2 years, I believe, for the state Supreme Court to overturn the conviction. They did it on a technicality. It's one of those like kind of landmark cases of like, how do they decide if it's vehicular homicide or not? He still was driving really reckless, but besides the point, you shouldn't be allowed or even have any interest in adopting a child if you're facing 25 years in prison. And also a judge signed off on this at some point on my adoption. There was a home study done, like the government was involved. How all of that happened, I don't understand. I like reached out to the Department of Health in my home state and asked some of these questions. They couldn't really give me any answers. They told me that all of those records were sealed and that I would not have access to them unless I tried to go in front of a judge in my home state. And even then, I was very unlikely to succeed. So I still have no idea why they decided my parents were fit parents. And it kind of just like opened my eyes to, oh my God, this whole thing was a sham. This whole thing was about them getting something that they wanted, whether that was a replacement daughter, that was them finding a reason to get married to each other again for the third time, which they did right before they adopted me. Like, was it for my dad to appease my mom? Like, there's for them to be good, generous Christians. Like, there are all these different things at play, and it just becomes so obvious that the altruism, is that the right word, was not there in the way I thought. It was incredibly selfish from the beginning. And I think,
Wow.
sadly, a lot of adoption stories are probably like that.
Feel free not to answer this, but can you contrast that just a little bit more with the story you were given? Like, what were they? What like they did they cover? The like trial was never mentioned to you growing up or anything, right? Like what? And you,
Um, so it was in a way. I didn't know this until later. When I brought this up to my mom, she's like, "You knew about this," and I was like, well, "Excuse me." What I had always heard was a story about how my dad was in a really bad car accident before I was born, and he never wears his seatbelt. He doesn't, and he still doesn't. My dad is he's crazy. And he has no care for other people or himself. And so, anyway, he didn't wear a seatbelt, and he was in this really bad car accident with a semi truck, and he should have died, but he didn't because an angel saved him. When he woke up, his seatbelt was on. Uh,
wow,
and then to find out as an adult that somebody did die in that situation, and it was because of my dad's behavior, um, like I was shocked.
I'm sure.
Um, yeah, it's really gross. So there's that. And then I think too, along with the story, then it had always just been like, I was told, oh, for the first week of my life, I lived at my aunt and uncle's house with my mom. And they always would like talk about it like it was some like really nostalgic, sweet time. And again, like I'm usually an inquisitive, direct person, but when this topic always came up, I always just thought, oh, they're talking so sweetly about me, about when I was a baby and when they chose me. There's nothing to question. I mean, why was I at my aunt and uncle's house? Like what, like that doesn't make any sense. None of this makes sense. And so now I'm like, oh, because people were going to trial and dealing with lawyers, and there's a lot going on. And now I
Wow.
have some more clarity on like what all that really was referring to.
It's like the inverse of a Hallmark version of of adoption, your story. Like, it's literally like it's kind of a flipping on of its head of all the stories you would hear about adoption, right? Like I feel like the stereotype would be like you would be taken from your parents to your biological family, like if someone was writing it like as a script, right? Like, it's like they
Yeah.
were in this horrible family,
Yeah.
and then you got rescued and taken to this family. Because I think that's what
Yeah.
people picture in their mind sometimes, especially when someone's adopted, like, locally and not internationally, right? Like, they think, like,
Mhm.
"Oh, like, it must have been a heroic, stepping in type of situation." Because
Yeah. Have
why
you
else
ever
would someone adopt a kid? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Have you ever seen, Matilda? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a book, but the movie, that's
Yeah, yeah.
usually what I go to, like, explain to people from the beginning, like, oh, what my family's like or what my
Wow.
childhood was like, because I'm pretty sure, right, too, they, like, stole her basically from the hospital, and that's why she was
Right.
nothing like them, and she was so much smarter than them. Like, that was the whole part too. Like, when I say I'm nothing like my family, like, I look nothing like them. I'm blonde, naturally, and my family's all has brown hair, and they would, like, call me their blonde baby from God. Um,
Yikes.
yeah. Yeah, my dad, like, entered
Yikes.
me in beauty pageants because I have blonde hair and blue
No.
eyes. Yeah, I was, like,
Uh,
fetishized completely, which is
yeah.
a thing in adoption and for one, to fetishize babies and, but all of that. And so not only just we look different, but we have completely different personalities and completely different IQs. And
Yeah.
I can think of so many things off the top of my head that as a kid I questioned, and my parents gave me really strange answers, and I was like, that's not how it works. Easter is on a different day every year. Why don't my
Mhm.
parents know that? Like, not to be super rude, but like, it
Yeah,
just
right.
that it's genetics, it's the way it is. And
Yep.
they could not handle that I, as a child, was smarter than them a lot of
Right.
times. And I understand that
Yeah.
as a parent that must be, very difficult, but there's when you're adopting, you really don't get to choose. There's no, like, guidebook. You can't really make any judgments off of, kind of what you were like as a kid or anything. It's
Right.
roulette.
It's like the communication issue of, like, when you have a partner or get married or something like that. Like, there's just two family communication styles and stuff, like, going on there, and that's where a lot of relationships run into difficulties, romantic ones. You're gonna have the same thing, but only amplified when you have, like, the power dynamic of a parent to kid relationship. Like,
Yeah.
that's gonna be very confusing for both parties along the way, which some people can prepare for and, like, make it, like, work for sure, but it's just like it's definitely like you're saying, it's a little bit of a roulette wheel.
Yeah, I think everyone needs to just hold more open-handed that nature versus nurture conversation. I
Mm,
think that there's reasons to find comfort in both, and I think they're both there. I, for a long time, which you could probably guess from the way I talked about how I felt about my adoption as a kid, thought that there was a lot more to nurture than nature, and that was probably impressed on me. But you know what? When I FaceTimed my biological mom to talk to her about the thing I found out about my adoption and my dad, um, we haven't talked in years, and we have both dyed our hair the same color. It's cut the same. We're both wearing a black sweater, sitting at our desks with a heat pad in our laps, wearing glasses. Like, it, it was like looking in a mirror. And to me, that's just like, look, there is something to nature and you can't help it. And
yeah,
we have to be willing to understand that about people and not put adoption on this pedestal and think that just because you take a baby and you put it in a home with loving parents from day one, that they're going to be like you. Because that
yeah.
has been what has been taught.
Yeah, and it's almost like it's almost presented as an alternative too sometimes, like, "Oh, you can't have a kid, just adopt," almost like it's, like,
Hmm.
interchangeable when it's
Yeah.
obviously a very different thing. Before we talk more generally about just adoption, probably specifically in the US, you mentioned that, like, wrapping up 2022, like, this has been, like, a crucial, like, line of thinking for you, and that just kinda struck me
Hmm.
in are in, like, I assume I'm hearing it in the sense of like almost self growth. Like it's almost been like kind of a puzzle piece that's kind of make or something that's connecting some dots as far as you just understanding your identity now. I just wondered if
Yeah.
you had like anything else to kind of comment about that before moving on, because that's interesting to me that that can be such a important piece of your story now.
Yeah. John, when we were at Moody, things would happen in my family, like really crazy things. And I would be like, oh, I don't think I'm going to go home for Christmas this year. Or I think I need to take some space from my family members and then figure out how to maybe perhaps confront them on something or ask for boundaries. And when I would do that or communicate that to my friends at the time, I would be met with a wall. I would be told, these are your parents. I would be told, everything you can imagine that you would receive already. And then on top of that, which, probably they didn't, I don't think they ever said this directly, but something that I've been learning about when you are adopted, you carry this sense of guilt that is unspoken because already there is a stigma that you owe your parents something because they raised you, because they fed you, because they clothed you, because they. What happens when you are adopted? That weight, the thing that's brought, they bought you, you know, like they rescued you. And so you feel like you owe them so much. And I already, when we were at Moody, I had gone through so much where I probably shouldn't have had a relationship with them. But between the Christianity and the guilt that I was experiencing and the things people were saying to me that I considered to be my closest friends, or even professors that I confided into, or people at church, I felt like I had to keep giving my family chances over and over and over for the most insane things. Like I could make a huge list. You would be like, what is this soap opera of a life? It's insanity. And there was something about finding out this blockbuster detail about my life that, along with no longer being religious, finally gave me the freedom and the courage to just end it. And I am like really thankful for that I have something very definitive to point at and to say, this is definitely the line, and this is allowed to be the line. And anyone who is empathetic and sober minded will agree with me. And now I can focus on myself and what I want my life to be like. And I can kill the chatter in the background of, well, what about this family that chose you? Because they
Wow.
chose me for the wrong reasons and I don't owe them anything.
Wow. I mean, I'm just so happy for you, like, honestly, that you've kind of had that breakthrough. And, like, the line might have been, a few years back or whatever, but it is kind of nice to have that, like, final, like, this is unquestionable. Like, this is like,
Yeah.
this is definitive. And thank you so much for, like, even with your story and the trauma that, like, goes with it, one, sharing it freely, but also being willing to talk about the topic still, and, like, care about the topic still of just like adoption, partially I'm sure because you worry about people either in similar spots than you, or like also want to kind of debunk certain kinds of narratives of like the noble adoption. Not that there aren't good people who adopt, it's just like you don't ever want to have your head in the clouds. And as you and I are well familiar with our Christian background, just because something sounds nice does not mean it is nice in practicality.
Yeah.
And there's usually other things going on.
Yeah. No, I'm very glad to talk about it, John, too, because to be honest, until this happened to me and I started trying to do research about like adoption law in Iowa at the time, things like this, I had no idea what was going on in the United States with adoption. I had no idea the history, and the things I've learned, I am appalled at. And I think it's really important for people to know because it's still going on and it needs to change. a lot of things need to change.
Absolutely. Just in my cursory, very juvenile middle school level research, just preparing for this podcast, I was like, dang. Like I was like, I didn't even go that far, and I was like, this is a bad system. Um,
Mhm.
but so let's talk about it a little, and I'm sure I will learn a lot with the audience, as you are forever the researcher and reader, and so I'm looking forward to learning stuff too.
Can't
Um,
help it.
I feel like I feel good. I feel like a big narrative that goes on is that adoption is expensive. Like I think that's like the first thing that a lot of people think when they think of like the systemic level of adoption. And so they're like, it's expensive because of medical expenses, of both, just having a child, but then also children in general are expensive things. So let's say a couple wants to adopt. Do you think like expense is one of the barriers that like keeps people from adopting, supposedly?
So the medical expenses you talked about, that's like actually probably one of the smaller parts of what you're paying for when you do an adoption. The bulk of what you're paying for is legal fees, up to like about $15,000. And then on top of that, you're also paying for search fees to an adoption agency, which can run you up to like $7,000. You have to pay for background checks and education and training and stuff also through the government and through the adoption agency, which can be another $5,000. You're paying for travel. So what is expensive is private adoption. People who want babies and very young children who they want to source them. Like I said, a search fee to find perhaps ones that do not have disabilities, ones that do not come from people who were using drugs. When you work with a private adoption agency, you're going to face up to $60,000 in fees. If you were to adopt a foster kid, it's less than $1,000.
Wow. Yeah. Isn't that fascinating, right? Because it just points to a very clear socioeconomic thing happening there. like
Mm-hmm.
like it's just like, it's the our watchdog spirit of watchdogging the patriarchy and like and like white privilege are like, wait a minute, the flag on the play.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I want to get even more into that, but I want to go ahead since we're already mentioning foster systems. This is a world I'm a little more familiar with since I've worked with kids in foster systems before.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, not extensively, but certain kinds of training I've received about it. But I think like one of the things that people who, either have never adopted or have never, had adoption close to them think that orphanages still exist. Um, and like they
Ah.
don't really, because most domestic adoptions, they don't involve traditional orphanages, like the idea of a bunch of kids waiting around in a house. That's not really happening anymore, at least in the US. And so it's been primarily replaced with those two things, the foster system and then private adoption agencies. And in fact, prior to welfare reform in World War II era, orphans used to be placed on trains, literally. And so the phrase put up for adoption was you put them up on the train. Um, and so you put them up
Mm-hmm.
for adoption, and then respected members of the community would come. And I don't mean to laugh because it's kind of horrifying, but
Yeah.
it's also just sounds
No.
kind of silly. Like it sounds like a
The
musical.
boxcar children.
Yeah,
For
exactly.
real.
Yeah, and so like
Kids on
members of
trains.
yeah. I just picture like people with top hats and monocles coming by the train to pick up a child.
Mm-hmm.
But seriously, respected members of the community would come, and whatever respected meant. And then advocates, began to argue that like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just be putting children on trains. And like actually have them like in in-home settings. And so that's kind of like the origin of the foster system developing into what it is. And so on the foster care side, there's somewhere around 400,000 kids in foster care, and that number is pretty consistent. It goes up and down a little, but usually around 400,000 kids in a foster care system. And about half of those kids, the plan is to go back to the biological parents. Like that's what's put in the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other half are going to be adopted in some sense, or like stay in the system until they're 18 and graduate out of it, or they move in with a relative is also pretty common. So, with that being our current system, is that a crisis, 400,000 kids, or is that fine since they've got like a foster home and they're not on trains anymore, they're not in orphanages anymore. So, can we still say there's like a crisis with all these kids who are in the foster care system, or is the system pretty good?
the system is not good. I mean, it's doing better, I think. I'm not a kid who was in the foster care system ever. I do know a little bit too because I do mentor a girl who is in high school and in the foster care system. And in her situation, it has actually been really pretty good for her. I know her foster parents, and they're actually very great people. So I've been glad to like see something redemptive in that from all the bad stories I've heard. I don't know. It's one of those questions where it's like, well, I don't have the answer. I just know that we could be doing better. And when it comes to Christians, I'm looking at you because
Yeah.
they
Christians
Christians.
very rarely use foster care systems.
So I have a lot of hard data actually on some of these things. So one thing I will say too is that so if there is this study that was done in October, and it is the largest study to have ever been done on adoption and families. And they're continuing to flesh it out. It's 1 out of a 3-part series. It's very needed. There's a lot of interesting things that I can share from it that kind of help explain who's adopting and in what way. One fact I would point out is that if you are making over $150,000 a year and you are going to be adopting, you are definitely doing private adoption. No matter what. The people who are doing fostering and intercountry adoption are people who usually make less money. So if you have money, you want to choose your baby. And no, there's not always something wrong with this, but that's how it kind of feels to me.
Well, you should point that out though.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and keep going with the data. Like, give me all you got. I'm just like, I think that's a worthy thing to kind of contrast. Because again, I'm only really familiar with the foster system and both the pros and cons of it. Private adoption agencies, I'm much less familiar and only really have some anecdotes. So yeah, you said this study came out in October.
Yeah. So another
Wow.
thing, so
Nice.
what you had just said too about Christian. So I have some hard information on this stuff from the study and then stuff that I've kind of pulled myself. So, because I was curious, I was like, well, I know what's being said. I can talk about the pipeline, so to speak, that happens in churches in the pew when it comes to talking about adoption. And I love to get into that. But I really also wanted to make sure I knew like what is happening, who is adopting. So Christians are responsible for 80% of adoptions that are happening in the United States. That's a mix of both Catholic and Protestant to get that 80%. And it actually is pretty split according to this data. 78% of private domestic adoptions are done by Christians. 79% of foster care adoptions are done by Christians. If we break it down and look at that data. What I did think was interesting that when you look at the reasons that they self-report for adopting, 50% are either adopting because of infertility or a desire to extend their family. When other options are like to provide a permanent home for a child or religious calling. So fertility and the desire to extend family are actually big reasons for why Christians are adopting. At the same time, I pulled some data about like states have to report on how many adoptions are happening each year. And I also took some Pew Research data and kind of broke out, well, which states lean more red and blue and what can we learn from that? So on a national average, someone is 14% higher to adopt publicly through the foster care system than through a private agency. I'm really glad to see that. I mean, the money is probably a big hindrance. Why, if you really want to, it's going to be, tougher in some areas for sure. Easier financially with some assistance to do it publicly. Right. So we said that number nationally an average is 14%. If you are in a blue state, that chance increases that you will go through the foster care system 61%. You're 61% chance higher that you will adopt through the foster care system. If you look at the states that contain a percentage population that is 40% or greater evangelical Protestant, the likelihood that someone will adopt publicly is only 10% more than private. So we went from blue state, 61% more likely to adopt from the foster care system. Are you evangelical Protestant heavy state? You're only 10% more likely.
That is fascinating, right? That is so interesting, and it explains why so much of like Christian adoption agencies will spin the data slightly differently and like do those things and like lump Catholic and Protestant together and stuff and like try to make it sound one way, you know.
Yeah. Well,
When
they did parse it out. I did. I added them together so that I could give you an easier number, I will say. But yeah, it is very interesting to kind of look at this. And, you know, of course, so the study that they did, right, it's the first study this big of this nature. But also like that means it's random people. They got these people to give this information to answer these questions by emailing a list they had. And so it's good information, but how do we know who is answering, from what states, from which is it even demographic? You know, it's just, an idea. So that's why I tried to like look a little bit further to just see. So, I definitely think it needs more. We need more understanding of who is adopting and why.
And that's why a lot of the data I looked at was just like the most objective I could find, which is just the government reporting on foster care, because that's really the only data that's even being kept track of, because they have to keep track of that data.
Well, that's what annoyed me about this study too, is that they broke up some of the further data points by private adoption, intercountry, and public. And so on public, they have a lot of information. Intercountry, they have a lot, just not as much as through foster care. In private, this was their time to get that data, and they had like 1 page of information. I was like, are you kidding me? Like,
it's
get these
probably
people.
difficult. It's probably difficult to get the data, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Which points to some other problems. Let me operate on our limited, foster care system data that so most kids who enter the foster care system are less than a year old, and the primary reason that the state is giving for them being entered is neglect, with the second biggest one being drug abuse. So that's pointing to something systemic. I'm not sure what. And then also, most kids who do end up exiting the foster care system exit between the age 1 of 5. And then after that, their odds of either adoption or reunification go way down. Like once they hit 6 years old, they're either going to stay in the foster system their whole life or have some sort of alternative situation. That's not just a straight up adoption or living with their biological family. It's usually going to be a relative. It seems to be the most common thing. So what are your general thoughts on that? Do you think that's pointing, and you can be guessing, you can be throwing more data at me, but like, what do you think? Do you have any guesses as to why both, like, there's a systemic thing with neglect happening that is usually what sends people to the foster care system, and then there's the kind of desire for babies? And you also brought up in private adoption agencies, it's usually they're looking for a baby too, and not necessarily someone older than 5 years old.
Yeah. There's a mix of things at play, John. I think it's the history of adoption in the United States and some things that happened in the mid 1900s that we haven't kicked out yet. And it also probably has to do with, I feel like we mentioned this book on the last episode we recorded, but The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Like, just part of nurture and nature. Like, kids grow up, they have trauma. When a mom gives birth to a kid, if the mom has trauma, the kid develops similar neuropathways. We have had a lack of resources for new parents, for medical or mental health resources. For, you look at some other countries like Sweden and the way that they take care of people and make sure that they're on a good track for having secure attachments and growing to be healthy people who they themselves can later be parents who have healthy kids. It's a cycle, and it's either a cycle that is harmful or a cycle that is beneficial. And the United States has not picked up the pace when it comes to us understanding this about humanity and equipping people to make healthy changes. So sadly, you see a mix of, well, when somebody is pregnant and they, weren't given the resources they need, whether that's sex ed, contraception, access to abortion, they are traumatized. They are told, they either feel like they can't be a good parent. They perhaps, will not be a good parent. They give their kid up. Their kid enters the foster care system. And then we have a cycle of people then who age out of the foster care system. They were not adopted. They were not taken care of. They face systemic issues of being able to hold a job, to go to college, to take care of themselves. They themselves, many may end up on the streets and then start the cycle again. And the only way we can break this is with resources around sex education, medical care, mental health, and helping new parents be new parents and helping keep families together. It's very important. That's kind of my take on that, but I'd loved also to talk some more about the history.
Yes, let's get into that history. I think it'll be very relevant. The only comment I wanted to add is I'm like, yeah, it's not. I don't think most people neglect a child because they're just bad people who don't care about children.
No.
Those people exist, sure, but I'm like, in general, like, it's a very painful thing. Like you said, it's a very traumatic thing to give up a child, even if someone pretends it's not. Like, there's going to be feelings that person has, and likely they were probably a victim of some larger systemic issues, because if we're thinking that most people, and of course on the nature side, like, you would think if you have a child you want that child, like, in general. But this also goes back to debates about abortion as well too, and like how that's like needs to be a necessary thing for many people. But yeah, okay, so I just to affirm that, yeah, I also think this points to something much larger than just like, we got some bad parents, like, I think that's a much deeper thing than that. But yes, please get into that history, please.
Before 1851, there are no regulations at all when it comes to adoption. And adoption, even in the biblical times, which, like we said, we'll talk about later, but even right up before this, adoption did not look like what we think of as adoption. Right? There was no like old family, new family. If that was happening, when that did happen, like for real, like someone's identity was completely changed, taken in by this family, that would have been an utter secret because of the stigma that came around. Being a bastard, honestly. And so instead, what would happen is that probably extended family members, or maybe it really was like another family entirely, but in the United States would take in a child under the guise, maybe some people had better intentions in this, but in my mind, from whatever, under the guise of, education and labor training, free labor, apprenticeship, or charitable support. That was what adoption looked like. It was not, we want to take in this child and make it our own, change their last name, first name. They have no idea who their parents are. Like, that was not it at all. But, like I said, sometimes this was happening and in complete secret. And so in 1851, the first adoption statute occurred in Massachusetts. And so finally it gave courts the power to intercede, which was rare, but sometimes they did in order to say, hey, child, your real family sucks. They are abusive and treating you terribly. And we are going to suspend their rights and make sure that the people that take care of you are good, fine, fair people. And that's the start of children's rights for the first time. And a lot was being done, research and study on how do we best take care of children instead of strictly adhering to the interests of adults. And they were going so far, they were looking into like, we should pair children with a family that's a similar race, with a family that has a similar religion or culture, with parents that have a similar IQ even. Like a lot was being done to study this and to try to learn how to best take care of vulnerable children. So up until the 1930s, adults faced very few formal restrictions on their access to their original birth certificates and adoption records. It was not a secret. The judges, the courts were like, yes, of course you need to know. And in fact, we know that it's important that you need to know. Obviously, you're going to have questions. But then with the start of World War II and the high desire for parents to adopt children, they began to seal adoption records. And within less than 10 years, all states but 2 sealed access. And this means that someone who is adopted has no right to find out who their natural parents are. They can go to court and ask for non-identifying information. They may be given something. But in order to receive identifying information, you basically need to show that you probably have severe mental health issues, and that you need to know if your natural family has severe mental health issues, which they would probably say, of course you have severe mental health issues because you are an embarrassment. But really though, like this is why this started happening is because, I mean, there always has been that there's been a stigma, which is why it was kept secret, right? Like women who get pregnant out of wedlock must have been whores. They must be mentally incapacitated. They are terrible, terrible people, and they have no right to have a child. And if the child finds out that they are adopted, then they will be incredibly embarrassed and put down in society. And it's better that we keep all of this a secret. And the most generous thing that a birth mom can do is to give up her baby to a loving Christian family. So this narrative exploded. And it continued through the 1950s to the point that all of that stuff I talked about, that research that was being done in the late 1800s about how to take care of children and what their needs are and knowing their identity, that was blacklisted. It was removed. No one could access these scholarly articles that showed that keeping open records was important and vital to people's health. So we have all of this secrecy, all of this push. And then in the 1970s, when the kids from the 50s become adults and realize, hey, I want to know who my natural family is, they begin to kick back. But at the same time, in the 70s, adoption was at its peak. There were an annual 175,000 adoptions happening each year in the United States. And nearly 80% were arranged by adoption agencies. So this was a huge system. And they were able to build this off of the concept that you don't need to know your natural family. The best thing you can do if you're in a bad situation, birth mom, is the best way to be a mom is to not be a mom and to give your kid away in complete secrecy. And then, per the evangelical Christians, they would say, you know what? You did this whole family thing backwards. If you just keep it a secret and you never tell anybody and you work on yourself, then maybe when you find a man, you can even convince him to know that you're a virgin and you what child? You've never had a child. And then maybe you'll get a chance to do this whole Jack and Jill perfect white Christian marriage thing. and renew yourself and be the woman that you were supposed to be. And your child, if the child goes looking for you, well, they have a mental health issue. They should just rely on their lovely God-given chosen family. Nothing will ever replace that. So as this continued and pushed and people said, no, like we need access to open records, the pro-life movement absolutely enveloped adoption and used it to fuel their fire. So the Right to Life organization lobbied to keep records sealed through the 80s and the 90s. So at this point, right, we've gone 30 years between 1940 and the 70s of like having records sealed in the United States, and lots of people saying, no, 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 no. It's going to take another 30 years to even begin to undo this, because the pro-life movement said, you know, if those moms can't give up their baby in secrecy, then you know what they will do in secret? They'll have an abortion. And we can't have that. And all these moms, they trusted us when they did their closed adoption. So who are we to go back on our promises and open those up? We can't. We shouldn't. So instead, as a consolation prize, they gave the people mutual consent registries, which was the idea that birth moms and adoptees could, unbeknownst to each other, go to their local state and say, hey, I want to give my identifying information. And if both people separately came and said that, then the information would be shared. So in 1985 to 1987, over a 2-year period in the state of Ohio, 900 birth moms signed up for this consent registry, and only 2 were matched with their children. It was a joke. Like, this was just them trying to give a dog a bone, and act like you have something now. We don't need to give you access to your birth certificates. So in 2000, this group formed called Bastard Nation, who continues to work today to lobby for legislation for open records. And finally, in 2000, they were able to push through the first of this legislation in Oregon and Alabama. Now, 23 years since that, only 11 more states have adopted this legislation. And in 37 states today, adoption records are still sealed and kept from adoptees, all because of stigma around out-of-wedlock marriage, views of the church and marriage, because of patriarchy, because of the pro-life movement. And Christians are using this platform and adoption to push to get the children that they want, and pretending like they're there to help when there's just so much harm being done. That, to me, if we really want to continue to make adoption be this beautiful thing that I was always taught, I think it's possible, but it will not be possible unless it isn't stopped being done in secret and people have the right. Adoptees who grow up and are no longer children, that children are not seen just as children, but as the adults that they will become with choice. For the adults that they will become, that will be both from nature and nurture, then I don't think the adoption process in the United States will ever be one that is healthy.
Well, thanks for coming on. It's been a great episode. No, I mean, what more to say, you know? But I do think there's several things brought up in that narrative, and I did learn a lot, just like factual information in that was very helpful. So thank you. There's 2 big things that stick out to me. One is just capitalism, right? And it just, like, you know, I'll just say the word. I know some people might get upset. Slavery, child labor, child slavery. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of the origins of this, right? It is, you know, labor laws for children are a late invention. They are not, you know, like, I'm like, people, and there's still many countries that do exploit child labor still. So there's that element of it. Then we also have this kind of, there maybe 3 things. So we have this the origins of this, not great, right? Just like if you want to point to the origins of cops, like it's not a good thing. And so like just when your foundation is so messed up, it makes it really hard to reform it into a good thing, right? when it's just foundationally, especially when you don't acknowledge how bad that foundation is. Like it just makes it really hard to make any positive steps in reforming it. So you have that thing. Then you have what you've brought up several times, which is the stigma, right? Both seemingly of the mom, especially, of course, because sexism, but like you have the stigma placed on the mom and also the child of just like, you are not normal. Like it's just automatically assumed that you don't get, you're othered, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you are not doing this the correct way, because there's this vision of a nuclear family. Again, you tied that so eloquently to like, Christian ideals for marriage and patriarchy and the rest of it. So you got that. And then you have this third thing, which is like this evangelical, predatory, quiverful-esque kind of like
Mm-hmm.
dark, underhanded, like, we need the children basically for converts. They'll be
Yeah.
very cautious about saying that directly. Sometimes they're
Yeah.
not so cautious.
Also, because they are just struggling with infertility. Like we said, like we
Right.
have their reasons for doing it, and it's to expand their family,
Right.
and probably maybe because they're infertile and not because
Right.
of what they're saying it's for.
Right. But even on the infertility thing, like some
Mhm.
people, if you don't have a Christian worldview, infertility is not as stigmatized, right? But like in a Christian worldview, if you can't have children and you got married, it's like, well, then you're like doing something less Christian by not having children. So like, it also plays into that, because evangelicalism has this very good MLM style way of like brainwashing people and making it a cult, and like and doing these things, and like they have patchwork for this, so like again, like the irony of someone being pro-life but being like like not caring about a mother's right to choose, because if she has a right to choose, she might not choose them and like they are the better option, just like these kind of funnels. So we'll put a kid in a foster system that has problems, or we'll put him in a private adoption agency that has problems, in order to prevent all of this. It's just creating a very clear picture that like none of this gives a shit about the kid, right?
No,
Like it's
John,
just
I
like, this is,
saw. Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. Finish your sentence.
I mean, that was, I can land
That was
there.
it.
No one gives a
Okay.
shit about the kid.
Yeah, no, I okay, so I one of the links like on the website for that study that I saw, they said they're doing this next one in tandem with this group, and this group partners birth moms and potential adopters through with agencies. And not only is the website just chock full of that trope, the generous birth mother, like barf, I mean, like it's hard because, well, one, it's not always true, in that like that should not be why someone gives up their child, because they feel like they're doing the most generous thing, and then that later if the kid is upset with it, you can't be upset with me, I did the best thing for you. And but then also like there's this trope that I kind of talked about of like convincing birth moms like this is the most generous thing you can do as a mom, is to not be a mom, and then later like keeping them from knowing their kid. Okay, so one, that's very problematic and very much like a thing that was formed from the church. But then secondly, there was this stat on the page that I'm like, y'all need to take this down. It says that there right now are 32 people looking to adopt for every one child. And I'm like, for private adoption, that must be what the number is you're looking at, because of how many kids are sitting in the foster care system. And you're going to advertise this? Like, what are y'all doing? How, like, they want children, but they want babies. And they're saying to themselves, oh, well, you know, God's giving us a trial. Like, we are struggling with infertility, but we're just going to trust that God's going to put a baby in our path. And, maybe this is a chance for us to do something. It might be kind of hard, but like, we've been talking to some adoption agencies, and maybe we can just give like a new precious little baby girl a home. And I'm like, dude, why, if you're sitting around waiting on a wait list, there are so many kids, teenagers, that need home and need love. And what you're doing is participating in a system that separates families. And I don't, and this brings it back to, sorry, these are just rants and thoughts. And you ask about like orphanages and the foster care system and all this. I think that there's something that we're missing, something else, that maybe some kind of organization that needs to happen in the middle, where we stop like ushering kids into a system where if they don't get picked up soon, they're just stuck in it forever and their outcomes in life are so limited, versus this other where we're fetishizing children, babies, and trying our best to, as soon as possible, separate them from their birth moms. Like, there needs to be some more structure, some more way to make it not like either we're going to the shelter or we're getting a pure breed. Like, honestly, that's what, if I have felt like that. I have felt like I am a dog that was picked up at the shelter.
That's so powerful. I mean, you said the quiet part out loud. I mean, it was in my brain too. And like it it's so tragic, right? Because again, none of this is prioritizing the child, which should
No.
be like, the child is the most helpless thing out there, right? Like, just based on our system, like in some ways, it's like maybe the train was better, like you start like
Yeah.
thinking crazy thoughts because you're like, at least they had some form of autonomy. Like, you're like, this is like really stripping people down to
Yeah.
bare bones, and it's very sad. And it
Mhm.
obviously causes trauma, either of those, right? Like the purebred or the sheltered kid. Like, you feel the same, like the behavior problems and like all the dehumanizing things you could say about it too. But like there's certainly going to be trauma like associated with that, right? And like, we're not really factoring that in because capitalism doesn't factor in trauma. But yeah. So, but here's one thing I did want to ask before we start really digging into Christians even harder, because this is an easy issue to do it on, in my opinion, because I think it really points to their hypocrisy larger than anything in a lot of ways. But I think about couples that do think about adoption, and couples, or even a single person. I just know it's much more difficult for a single person, but a single person or a couple is thinking about like, maybe we'd like to adopt, and they do have like some good motives for that, right? Like, they feel that they might want to adopt from a foster care system, or like I hate to say feel called, because that phrase kind of makes me cringe, but I know people that like that means something to them, and I don't think it's necessarily like a bad thing they feel that way. But let's say they come to you, they hear you're adopted, they're like, Cierra, we've been thinking about adoption, we don't want to make any mistakes, which they're going to, obviously, so you can go ahead and
Yeah.
say, well, sorry, parents make mistakes.
Yeah.
But like,
I
what
would make
are some of
mistakes.
right, exactly, as would I. But like, what are some of the first things you would want to tell them? Is it this history? Is it some of your experience? Is it like what are some of the first thoughts that come to mind? Because we need to do two things, right? We need to reform the system. You and I have already alluded to, we don't know how, because it's so like convoluted, but it definitely needs restructuring. So there needs to be that. But there also, in the meantime, we need to, encourage people who want to adopt. I don't think we want to say, yeah, stop adopting people. Like, that's not necessarily a good route. So I'm just curious, what you're in an anecdotal way, what are some of the first things you would want to tell a couple who wants to adopt?
I tell them to get on the adopted sub on Reddit. I've been on there for a bit now and just like reading people's stories. Cause like I kind of said at the beginning, there's just so many different ways adoption looks and affects people. And I think it is an easier way. Like I said, you don't very often meet someone and then it just comes up, oh, I'm adopted. Like, this is a easier way to start to understand what are some of the things that could be traumatizing. What are some of the things that these people could ask, or this future child could be asking me? Like, just start to piece out some of that and like do the research on your own. Listen to podcasts that have adoptees talking. And also, I think too, something like I mentioned that I mentor. The reason why I started doing that, well, one, I was like, I've just have cared and wanted to find a way to like give back to my community when I started volunteering through Angels. It's a nationwide program for foster youth mentorship. And they also do this other program called Love Box, where you can just like care for you're like assigned a foster care family, and you once a month, like bring them a box of goodies and like check in and make sure like, is there anything they need to be supported? I think joining something like that would be good before ever considering adoption, whether it is the mentoring or it is just getting in there by watching and getting to know a foster care family firsthand. If you don't have that, even if you do have somebody, just adding to your knowledge of what that can look like, I think is a good way to parse out, are you really clear-headed about this? And do you really know what this could look like? It's been really foundational for me. And I was hoping too that by doing this mentorship, I would have a better idea if I wanted to foster in the future, like I have once thought I definitely would do. So it's a good way to test the waters, so to speak, and just see what would that be like for you.
I think that's great advice, honestly. And just like, like even if, let's say someone has a like career with children and they think they love children and they'd have no difficulty, it's like, it's still important to maybe take one more step of just like even fostering yourself, or even doing, kind of like a Big Brother program or anything like that, just to try to like, again, just like, because it's a different dynamic than just, like I'm a football coach and I get a lot of joy out of like coaching those kids, and I do feel like I have an impact on their life, and sometimes I do get that like biological urge to procreate after I hang out with them for a long time. I'm like, but then there's just kind of a reality check that needs to come with this idea of adoption, right? That like this is not a small thing, and you're also stepping foot into a mess of a system. Like it's not even your fault. Like you're going to now be participating in another system that is complex, and you don't necessarily have to understand everything, but you need to understand some foundational things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I could say one thing too, like what would be my one like lesson, I would say if you can't say this with your full heart, then you need to take a step back. Is that, let me say it the way that some people say it, in a way that I think is gross. We just really wanted to give. We just wanted to give this kid, and when they grow up, like if you foster or if you adopt like us, when your kid grows up, they're going to be so thankful for the life that you offered them. And you're going to get so much in return from them and from this relationship. Barf. No, you don't get to decide any of that. You don't get to decide if that kid is thankful for what you did. Because often too, if it's not through the foster care system and like they're a teenager, they may not know that like I didn't, what way my life would go if being with my biological family versus the family that adopted me, which one would be better. I'm not in like radically grateful because of what you decided would be a better fit for my life, and that you thought adopted parents, you're offering me something better, and one day I'm going to be super grateful. You don't get to decide if this kid feels that way. And also, you don't get to decide what kind of relationship they want to have with you in the future, just like a kid that you have on your own. But people get confused because when they think that they are saving a kid somehow, even when it's subconscious, and I totally understand when you see that a kid has been, especially again, talking foster care system, in some really horrible situations, like it can be, it can go to your head. I'm sure that if I was in that situation, I would have to do a lot of like heart checking and looking at that in myself and questioning it, because you're going to be really disappointed and put that kid in a really difficult position when they're an adult if you hold them to those things. And instead, I think the entire way it needs to be clear that this is an individual, this is their life, and you are doing your best to support them, knowing full well that you could get nothing in return.
That's super well put. I want to just harp on, obviously Cult of Christianity podcast. I kind of want to like hone in. You've brought up some really important foundational things that I don't want to necessarily rehash over and over again, but there is this like important narrative going on of evangelicals, saving thing, even what you just said, like almost a Messiah complex. And so you're right, like a lot of studies show that even not only Christians, but even specifically evangelicals are like up to twice as likely to adopt than others. Like there is a foundational thing where Christians are more likely to adopt. You can certainly put an asterisk on it, but like there's a thing, but they don't seem to be foster parents very often. And even when they are, that doesn't necessarily make them heroes. They're more likely to want their own kid. It seems like they want to take. I hate to use this language, but take a kid and make it theirs. So do you have general thought, like, do you share my skepticism that evangelicals, they say it's infertility, so it could be that motivation of, I just want a family and this is my way to do it. But do you think there's like something about evangelical doctrine that just like attracts evangelicals to adoption? Is it the pro-life movement? Like, what are some of your thoughts of that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the Bible is being taken out of context. I mean, I think if you've been in the church long enough, you've probably heard a sermon or two on adoption. As an aside, I'll say, that is also a hard part for why I struggled to understand how maybe my adoption wasn't the best thing, because anytime that storyline got brought up, how God adopts us as his own, damn, like I had to sit there and be like, oh, this is supposed to be a positive thing. This is supposed to be a thing I can relate to the most because I myself am adopted. And I'm looking around the room at all these people and they're like, wow, and you're adopted and you understand just like what that radical love and acceptance is like. Like, that's how adoption gets talked about in church. And interestingly enough, though, that's not what adoption means in the New Testament at all. So that little bit of history I said, I just think it's important to hit on so that you can really understand then in contrast what is being said in church. So when like Paul talks about adoption, how we are adopted like sons and heirs or something like that, okay? In Greek and Roman culture in the 1st and 2nd century AD, adoption meant either to give your adult son as an heir to a family that doesn't have an heir, or to adopt a son to be your heir. And the modern equivalent was simply naming a benefactor in your will. I'm getting this information from a podcast I listened to that was really informative called Adoptees On, with a woman that wrote her dissertation specifically on this, and she's also adopted. And she's still a Christian too. So it was a very interesting episode to listen to. It's like, let me see, I actually have it open. Her name is Dr. Erin. We're almost there in my tabs. Dr. Erin Heim. Wow, she's very knowledgeable about this and speaks very beautifully on the topic. But what she explained is that adoption absolutely back then had nothing to do with vulnerable children, and women couldn't adopt and women couldn't be adopted. It had nothing to do with that. The only purpose of adoption then was about inheritance, title, wealth, religion, and culture. And the adoptee, too, kept their original identity and family. And the only people who were really doing this were wealthy people and emperors. So the most significant adoption in all of Roman history is the adoption of Octavian Augustus by Julius Caesar. And that is what kind of adoption Paul is referring to. And yet in church, we talk about it completely differently. We talk about as like equating it with like the new identity we have in Christ because we're adopted. Where did we get that? We got that because of the evangelical pro-life movement that sealed adoption records. That's where we got that from, not from the New Testament. So it makes me really upset. And I also even did a word study because I just needed to freaking know.
Wow,
And the word,
I
I
haven't done
know.
that in a minute.
I know, but I did. Chris and I did it this morning. We were like, we need to know, what does the word orphan in the New Testament even freaking mean? Guess what? It just means uncertain affinity, bereaved,
Wow.
comfortless, fatherless. So you know what? When they talk about protecting the widows and the orphans, they actually mean moms and kids that don't have a male protector. And you know what the Christians are doing? They were separating them under the guise of like adoption is a beautiful thing that makes us like Christ. Look, it's the gospel in my living room. You see that poor kid over there, fatherless? Well, I took him in, just like God. Look at me, white savior me. And actually, the Bible does not talk about adoption as separating families, as giving new identity. It never was meant to. And yet, that is the paradigm that so many adoptees are forced into believing. And you're put and paraded around the church and told, look, you're a picture of the gospel. Aren't you grateful? Aren't you thankful? And then, like me, you find out something terrible actually went on and you're just astounded. Like, this was supposed to be the most beautiful, God loving thing. And we used all of this religious hype to make it so. And it's a sham.
Yeah, I was just all that was going on in my brain for that last bit. I was like, brainwashing. Like that's I'm
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
that's hand waving,
I know.
hypnosis. Like it
Yeah.
really does sound like that, you know.
Yeah.
And of course, the easiest person to indoctrinate is a kid, much more so a kid who is like kind of dumped into a stranger's home. Okay,
Yeah.
so one topic I definitely wanted to address, and I correct me if I'm wrong in my stereotyping here, but by the numbers, most children in the U.S. foster system are white. Um, Yet many white evangelical families I know, just personally, adopted international children and specifically not white children. I know one family that adopted like a white child, and it was still like a white child from China. So is that a pattern that I'm noticing? If it's there, and if it is a pattern, what's going on there? Is that problematic? It strikes me as weird.
Yeah, actually, so intercountry adoption is at the lowest it has ever been right now. That's for a few different reasons. COVID was a big reason. Also, the US government, I don't know what year, but they signed a law that prevents us from adopting from certain countries unless you're ensuring that those children don't have active parents, because that's a big thing. I don't know if you've ever heard stories about that, but basically, like, parents in a more undeveloped country might take their kid, kind of like we talked about, right? Sending their kids somewhere so that they could receive education and training and perhaps get them out of the system that they're in so they could have a better life. But then that place that they're sent to ends up partnering with an organization in the US and just like lets a kid be adopted, even though the kid has parents. And those parents never actually intended for the kid to be, or sometimes they do, but usually often not, sent
Yeah,
overseas. Anyway, so
kidnapping,
that
legal
was
kidnapping.
nixed. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
been nixed. And that's why literally I think I think I have this number. Yeah, in 2020, only 1,600 adoptions were inter-country adoptions compared to 58,000 adoptions from foster care and
Wow.
20,000 private adoptions. So I will say that, that amount has gone down a lot. And I think that's a good thing. I think that we need to focus on adopting the kids that are in our neighborhoods, and giving kids homes here before we start bringing other people into our situation. But also, when it comes to adoption from foster care, the US government has also made it a very large priority now to ensure the best they can that kids are adopted by the same race. And so it's not always true. And like, there are some, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but that report, the report's done by where is this? I know I have it written, National Council for Adoption, if anyone wants to look it up, because it's very interesting. And it'll go in depth about how, like, on race, how many white kids are adopted by white parents, white kids adopted by black parents, black kids adopted by white parents. Like, it kind of parses that out, and it's very interesting. And I think that it's actually, in my opinion, a fair number representation right now, where I think, like, that makes sense. And I'm not appalled. I'm not super upset. Like, I think we're doing our best, and it's doing a lot better than it has in past decades, and on a good trajectory.
Well, that's relieving to hear. I mean, a lot of these families I'm thinking about, I was like a child when this was happening. So I'd be interested. I'll have to on my own time go back a few decades and see, like, how are so many people able to record or to adopt internationally like so easily and have like I can think of several families. So I'm just curious. I'm like, it almost makes me feel like, oh wait, what was going on there? Like and yeah, it strikes me as problematic, but that's relieving to hear that the numbers are showing that's harder and harder to do. I mean, 1,600 is crazy small. Okay, cool. Well, I'm glad I brought that up. Here's my belief. Here's my church conspiracy stuff. So you already alluded to this whole like theology of adoption, right? And then you have and I think because of that theology, adoption is a badge of honor for evangelicals. And I mean having a biological kid is as well. However, there's like this weird complex where they feel like they're emulating Jesus more when they adopt because they have that theology of Jesus adopting all of us as his children. Totally, as you're right, just bad Bible work, bad theology, bad. And I think that means that most kids adopted by Christians will not only be more indoctrinated, like because they of some of the complexes that you were mentioning earlier of just like this, like you're special, you're this, you're that, whatever. And so like they'll be more susceptible to the Christian message, but I think they'll also be more ashamed because based on that theology, that's a very shameful thing. It's like, you know, you only have value because you're adopted, and so like that or that's your main source of value, and like you said, you can understand this theology more deeply. I don't think that's too harsh, and if I'm right about this theory, like should that affect Christians' rights in regards to adoption, especially when you have this foundational issue? Now obviously that's going to be a touchy thing to deal with, but I'm just curious what your initial thoughts are on like a Christian having the right to adopt based on their
I
history.
mean, I don't think that we're going to be limiting people's ability to adopt based on religion anytime soon. I mean, I do wish that just churches would change the way that they talk and teach about adoption, and that maybe there then was some more education. Um, especially if 80% of adoptions really are being done by Christians, like that is work that needs to be done. But maybe then I'm asking too much of the government, but that they could come up with some kind of explainer that says why maybe what you've heard about adoption could be harmful. Like that would be nice. But no, I don't think that we're gonna see that change or that we could make that change.
And I think that's worth bringing up. I'm reading a book right now. It's by my mentor, Bob Smintana, and he wrote this book called Reorganize Religion. And he talks about religion as a load-bearing wall in our society. That like you can say the wall is ugly, you can say it's bad, you can say it's like doing damage, you can say all that, but when you take away the load-bearing wall, what do you put there instead? And that's a conversation I think we have to have in regards to adoption, because I think you're right. I think Christians are kind of like taking the load here, and I don't think they're doing a very good job. And so yeah, it's not an issue of taking away their rights in regards to adoption, but I think you nailed it. It's like this education that needs to happen and this like changing of the narrative that needs to happen. And probably some practical things, like you said, like open records, just like some very like practical things that would just be kind of immediate things that would help.
Making room for adoptees to share their stories and ask real
Yeah.
questions in a church context instead of pushing on them a narrative too. I think there would just be a lot to learn.
Yeah, definitely. Two things. One, Cierra, I think you should start your own podcast that's all about adoption, because I would listen. And I think I think you're just so not only well informed, but very good at articulating it in ways that I can understand.
Oh,
I
thanks,
feel like
God.
I've learned a lot over the past 90 minutes, which is awesome. I always
Good.
love when I have a guest on and I learn a lot. That's like the most fun.
No,
But was there any other like things you did? I don't want you to feel like you left anything unsaid. So in regards to this
thank you.
topic, and especially in regards to if you can connect it to kind of like both your religious trauma or just like how you see evangelicalism at large.
This is totally I'm looking at my notes, and I would be amiss if I didn't mention this, just because this is a whole nother section of adoption history that like I can't speak to personally, but it needs to just be discussed, which is how another big thing that white Christians have done is separate Native families. And so we talked about, right, John, you said adoption as what was it you said? you said it really eloquently a while back about how it's used to like continue to run the church, and it's used to like promote like purity culture. It's used to promote the patriarchy. It's also used in genocide. And without killing people, another way to do genocide is to destroy their culture. And so that is another way that Christians have used adoption. And right now, the Supreme Court is hoping to um, give a decision on if the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act is constitutional, which is the law that said that Native tribes should be the ones to determine whether or not a Native child should stay with their family, or if not, who they should go to. Because for a long time, powerful white, often Christian men in government were either putting these children into homes and boarding schools, forcing them to no longer speak their native language, to not participate in their heritage, their religion, their culture, and to become Christians. And this is a really important thing that's being evaluated right now. I think it's really funny because it's happening and trying to be overturned in Texas, which if you look at the adoption numbers for Texas, they are one of the few states, red states, that full blown goes towards adopting privately far more than foster care. So why they care and want to have a hand in where Native children go in the foster care system, I don't know, but they do. And so I'm glad that you asked me if there's anything left, because that is an atrocity that also has been done at the hands of this type of stigmatization and religious pursuit that is absolutely grotesque and needs to continue to be an area of growth for us. But at the end of the day, like, I just think Christians need to reevaluate why they think what they do about adoption. And even those who are adopted need to question, what story do I tell myself? And is it okay if it's not this like completely cheerful, happy thing? Is it okay if I allow myself to feel sad or disappointed or grieved? Because there is always going to be something true to the fact that our natural mom is our natural mom. And dads too, but I mean, moms, and it's where we come from. And as a baby, the day you're born, it's so important that you be able to be comforted by your mom, and that heartbeat, and that genetic mirroring, all these things inherently. And when you experience something different, it is difficult in your life, whether you can name it or not. And there needs to be room for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what a good example to kind of just like hammer home the like, this is about control. This is about a narrative that Christians are perpetrating. And yeah, on the individual level, you can have your own feelings, however complex those feelings may be. And I think that's a good thing. But I think you're right that it's like evaluate where you're getting your narrative from.
I was gonna say my new favorite adoption story from the Bible, I don't know why I never thought of this before, God, is Moses. Are you kidding me? How did we not talk about that? Excuse me.
Put him in the water.
Yeah, but then he was like later, like, nah, y'all not my family. You try to make me forget who I came from. You're trying to hurt my people. These are my people, and not that, again, it's not every story is the same. And a lot of people experience, they really are given a better opportunity with a different family. But also, like, the Bible doesn't say that is the ideal, or that is the norm, or that is, we have other stories to look at too if we really want to talk about the different ways that we can look at adoption and the way it affects people.
Definitely. It can be a complex system, and it can be hard to wrestle through the complexity. What's dangerous is when you go to that black and white, fundamentalist, conservative, white, evangelical, whatever words you want to use. When you go to a cult that wants to make it black and white, that wants to make it like this is the narrative that we've accepted and don't question it. And I think you've done well to provoke many, many thoughts for people. So thank you so much for coming on. Is there any resources you want to promote? Your website. What do you want to? What do you want? If people just had, or I'll put it this way: is the subreddit the best place to go? Like, if people just want to hit one website to like learn more, which would you recommend?
Bastard Nation. Their website is a little confusing. They could use a little bit of help, I think, but they have all the information you need to know about the history of adoption in the United States and Canada, where they're at with legislation, what they're trying to work towards. And they are the voice when it comes to adoptees' rights. So I would recommend that. I'm going to maybe consider like looking in further with how to partner with them, because if you can't tell, I've become very passionate about this, and I would love for other people to help us pursue being able to have access to our records so that maybe one day I have the right to read the home study about why the government decided it was okay for me to be placed with my family, because it's not just their story, it's also mine.
And I can't finish any stronger than that. So again, thank you for coming on, Cierra. It's always a blast talking to you, and thanks for all the work you did to prepare for this and all that. That means a lot.
Of course, John.
Yeah, and thank you, listener, for stopping by. I will talk to y'all soon. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.